So we're talking about popular, famous challenges to the Torah's picture of the world, and one of them comes from archaeology. On my blog, I have at least 15 articles on archaeology, which I would recommend to you to look at, but I want to share one with you. One way that you can estimate the solidity of a supposedly scientific attack is to ask about the credibility, solidity of the branch of science from which the attack is coming. And one way you estimate the credibility of a branch of science is how recent have there been major revolutions in the branch. Revolutions that required them to rethink everything and re-examine their methodology and re-examine all their conclusions. And if the major revolution took place 15 years ago, that means let's put it quite kindly, it's an active science. And since it's an active science, you can expect that in the next 15 years there could be another revolution, and therefore the critique that they're throwing at you is probably not that solid. The last time there was a revolutionary change was 100 years ago. Then you could conclude that the branch of science is reasonably stable, but that leaves two possibilities. Either it's stable because it's found fundamental truths upon which it's based, or it lacks imagination, or it lacks objectivity. Those are all possible. But if you do find a recent revolution, then that's a good indication that there's enough instability to be cautious and suspicious about attacks that come from that branch of science. Now, of course, I'm saying these words with my tongue in cheek because to call archaeology a science is already a mistake. But okay, I'll leave that aside. I'll leave that for you to judge. In this respect, I said 15 years. Well, I have an article here from an Israeli publication called Haaretz. Now, for those of you who are innocent of Israeli journalism and politics, Haaretz is on the far left. Since it's on the far left, it definitely does not have a pro-religious bias. Did I say it has an anti-religious bias? I didn't say it, but I clearly implied it, and I certainly meant it. So bear that in mind, that this is coming from the people who don't support us and don't like us very much. This is, by the way, 2019. That's not even 15 years ago, is it? Not even 5 years ago. How about that? Really close in time. And the title of the article is, "A Chance Discovery Changes Everything We Know About Biblical Israel." Wow. Wow. A chance discovery changes everything we know. So does that give you any cause to doubt the things that they knew up until 2018? I hope so. If in 2019 there was a discovery that changes everything we know about biblical Israel, everything, not just a particular millennium, not just a particular piece of geography, but everything. Okay, let's listen to this. Is the Bible true? Do at least some biblical narratives have a historical foundation? Can archaeology answer that question? To what degree can broken walls, fragments, and stones tell the whole story? When it comes to the nomads of the biblical period, new findings show that the ability of archaeology to assist in constructing historical models has been extremely limited. The use of archaeology to uncover the truth about this type of population has been extremely limited. This has dramatic implications for understanding the genesis of ancient Israel when, according to the biblical account, it was nomadic tribes that created a kingdom. If archaeology can't find evidence and information about nomadic tribes because they are not within the methodology of archaeology, and if our sources say that we were nomadic, does that leave a gap, maybe? A little gap between what archaeology can show and what the reality was? And then, should I trust archaeology for its conclusions about what the reality was? Let's see. Until now, the scholarly literature has perceived non-sedentary societies of this region, people that did not live in permanent settlements, as Bronze and Iron Age Bedouin, simple societies that were ever on the margins of historical events, void of political power, and which cannot be identified with kingdoms or political entities wielding regional influence. In other words, either you build stone houses or you're worthless. If you don't build stone houses, you don't have an advanced political structure, you don't have a large-scale population, you don't have any influence on the surroundings around you. It's only the ones that have settled physical habitations which can create empires and can have power and influence. New archaeological discoveries in the Arava desert in the southern Israel and the Jordan, however, show that this approach is mistaken and that nomads were able to forge complex political structures that differed substantially from the conventional Bedouin model. So there are those who didn't build stone houses and who had large populations and a sophisticated political structure and could have a great deal of power, which is a change in the whole paradigm. But that we know in general terms. But the Arava case is exceptional in the world of archaeology. Nomads almost never leave behind significant archaeological evidence. If they don't build stone houses that you can excavate, where are you going to have archaeological evidence of their existence? But in the Arava we have it. It follows that many archaeological pronouncements concerning the period of the entry into Canaan, the era of the judges, and the Yeshivat monarchy, talking about hundreds of years, the conquest of Canaan, through the period of judges up until King David. That's something like 400 years. The archaeological pronouncements about that entire period have no sound grounds. Put that in 18-point font, black Gothic letters. No sound grounds to all what archaeology has said for those 400 years. That's a lot of stuff. Now, at least with regard to historical processes involving mobile populations, it is time to acknowledge the limitations of archaeology's contribution. The focal point of the discussion should be revert to the biblical criticism, the study of the text and its contents. Oh, the text. Not archaeological finds. Should really be concerned with the text, which they've forgotten, as you'll see. And research biases originating in simplistic archaeological pronouncements should be corrected. Okay, so now he gives a history of the Arava Valley and the dating that was undertaken on the basis of the assumptions. The assumption was we found vast excavations in the Arava Valley. Who did that? 10,000 mine shafts. Who's going to dig 10,000 mine shafts? What kind of population has workers that don't have to be in agriculture and don't have to make clothes and don't have to be, bakers and so forth and so on, have spirit, right? In Timnah alone, indicating an enterprise, an orderly, systematic search for subterranean deposits. Some of the shafts are more than 40 meters deep, 130 feet deep. Who's digging 130 feet into the ground? And in Feynman, more than 70 meters. And many develop into complex tunnel systems. There are tunnels joining the shafts. Scattered in the smelting camps where the furnace operated and raw copper was produced are dozens of heaps of slag and other industrial waste, some more than 6 meters high. A lot was going on here. So now, there remains to attest to production on a vast scale using advanced technological know-how. So now, who could do that? Who could make these kinds of excavations? Since the only powerful, rich, influential groups of population you have are the ones who are in fixed empires, it must have been some foreign empire that sent its crews over to do the excavations. This led to two possible datings for this effort. One is from the 11th to the 19th, 11th to the 9th centuries BCE, and the other, one second, let me get this right. Yeah, Nusser. Yes, the two that were assumed to have done this were the Assyrian Empire between the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, and the Egyptian Empire, the 13th and 12th. So you got 13 and 12th in here, and 8 and 7 here. Those are the two possibilities for this excavational effort, because those were two great kingdoms, two great empires. They had large populations. They could afford tens of thousands of workers to go and do all this mining. Yeah. Either 1312 or 98. But when they did some dating testing, it turned out that both dates are wrong. Both dates are wrong. The new evidence, according to new dating, is a uniform leadership from at least the 11th century BCE. So it's not 1312 and it's not 98, it's the 11th century. What to do about that? There was no empire and no kingdom during that period of time that could have undertaken the effort. So he says, there's a far broader contribution having to do with methodology. We know about the existence of strong nomadic kingdom in the Arava solely because of copper production. In other words, the conclusion is, if it wasn't this kingdom, it wasn't this kingdom, then it's a kingdom of people whose habitations are invisible. They're not preserved. That's a nomadic population living in tents. There must have been a giant population living in the Arava that undertook these excavations, and in order to sink 10,000 shafts, 100 to 150 feet deep in the ground, with tunnels joining them, and sophisticated smelting operations with vast mounds of industrial waste, it must have been a very sophisticated, organized, integrated population. So surprise, surprise, nomadic populations, which are invisible to archaeology, can be large, well organized, sophisticated, powerful, without leaving any archaeological trace. We know about the existence of a strong nomadic kingdom in the Arava solely because of its copper production. In other words, here he said this was the exception because if they're really nomads and live in tents, they won't leave behind any archaeological evidence. But here you have the exception. We don't have any evidence of their habitations, but we have the shafts. And since we have the shafts, we know that there was a large, sophisticated group of people who did it, whose habitations are invisible. The lesson is, when you talk about the existence of populations in other places, and you say we didn't find habitations, so they couldn't have been there, or they couldn't have been large, or they couldn't have been organized, maybe you're making a drastic mistake. Maybe they lived in habitations that don't survive. This has been a complaint against the Torah's picture of that history of time all the way down the line. There couldn't have been millions of people in Egypt because there's no evidence of their existence. The kingdom couldn't have been a kingdom because there wasn't evidence of the existence of that population of people. Even, as he's going to say, there's a famous verse after they come to Jerusalem, and the verse tells the people, go back to your tents. So listen to how far out they are. The verse says, go back to your tents. And these people said, it couldn't be in tents, could it? Surely not. They couldn't be living in tents. They have to be living in houses. It's just poetry. Tents of populations and so forth and so on. Couldn't be serious. Really. The text is irrelevant. Forget the text. We know better because we do archaeology, and the text is... Maybe the text is right. Maybe they really did live in tents. And that's why they're invisible. And you don't think there was any population because you can't find their houses. Yeah.
Sorry, Rabbi, but I think I'm a little confused. Were the mine shafts created by the Israelites, or is it just another group that created them that now proves that the Jews were nomadic for those 40 years?
At this point, we're not speculating on that. He's commenting on the technique of archaeology, methodology of archaeology, that they had a blind spot. They had a certain methodological principle that eliminated these populations. Once you recognize that these populations exist, as he said, this changes everything we know about the biblical period. In particular, you want to know about the size of the population. And if your principle is population is measured by the habitations that it leaves behind, which are physical habitations, then you're going to say that the Jewish population, if it's existed at all, is very, very small, because it left behind almost no physical habitations. If that's your principle, if physical habitations determine the size of a population, then there couldn't have been a large Jewish population for 400 years. 400 years, from the time of the conquest of Canaan until the beginning, and including the beginning of the monarchy, there couldn't have been a substantial population.
So we were nomadic more than just the 40 years in the desert.
Of course, exactly.
Okay, cool. Sorry.
That's right. You got a
And
question?
the mine shafts weren't necessarily. So the mine shafts weren't necessarily created by the Jews.
We haven't come to that yet.
Okay.
The whole point is, once you see this, you got to change your mind about everything.
Gotcha.
You can't trust the population. And then, if archaeology is describing ancient societies, population size is very important. That determines the economy, that determines the military, determines the capability of waging war, and all the rest. And if you got that very considerably wrong, this thing of the millions of Jews in Egypt, I don't remember when it was I guess the 80s or 90s. I went to Mexico City twice. In those days, Mexico City had 13 million inhabitants. 3 million were homeless. I thought to myself, when archaeologists dig up Mexico City in 1,000 years, what will they estimate the population to be? Will they opine? Will they find that there were 3 million homeless people there? How will they do that? How will they identify them? What remains are they going to leave 1,000 years from now? Yeah, you got a question?
Yeah, I think I missed I missed the importance of this source being from Haaretz and the fact that it's not a religious source.
I'm not sure what you missed. You want the date? I'll give you the date. You can look it up yourself.
I mean, just like so what's the point of it being from, why is that
Why is it relevant to say that it's not religious?
yeah.
Because these people are the people who say the Torah is not true, and the history is not history, and there is no God, and there are no miracles, and so forth and so on. That's their kav. That's their line. Right? And in particular, when they find that archaeology contradicts the Bible, that makes them very happy. Because it's not really true, it was all made up, it was made up later, it's myths about your ancestors, and so forth and so on. They follow that general line. This article is very honest. This article means, as he says, you have to reassess, and then you have to look at the text. Instead of trusting the archaeology, you have to look at the text and see what the text says. Maybe that's a more reliable reflection of the real history than you thought. It's uncharacteristic for Haaretz to carry an article like this. It's not art. No. If it was a religious source, you'd immediately be suspicious and say, they're making it up, they're exaggerating, they're twisting the evidence, so on and so on. By the way, it wouldn't be such a terrible thing to say, because archaeology is hotly contested. And the people who do archaeology are either true believers that the Bible is true, or true believers that the Bible is false. It's very rare to find someone who's sitting on the fence and is really an agnostic. You're either for or against, and you make your reputation on contributing to the school. That's so. This is really quite remarkable.
Are those usually Christians or Jewish archaeologists trying to prove the Bible?
On the contrary, lots of the Jewish archaeologists are against the Bible. The guys at Finkelstein, for example, and the guys at the Hebrew University, at Tel Aviv University, and so forth and so on, they're not in favor of the Bible. The fact that they're Jewish doesn't help them. Okay, so now, the basic premise in biblical archaeology that nomads could not create complex social structures, still less an actual kingdom, led to an observed situation in scholarship in which accounts in the biblical text itself that explicitly mention tent dwellings were ignored, as I told you a moment ago. Such accounts appear with regard to the early days of the Israelites in Canaan, but also in reference to the United Monarchy of David, 500 years later, and Solomon, and even a few generations afterwards. For example, in the famous scene of the split between Judah and Israel, the northern tribes left angrily back to their tents. This is after the death of Solomon. They're going back to their tents. So entrenched was this premise that you couldn't have a kingdom based on tents, that the proposal was made and institutionalized that the use of the word tent in a text referring to events after the establishment of the kingdom was meant figuratively. Couldn't be literal, because there can't be a kingdom with tents. And therefore, if they had a kingdom, there couldn't be tents. So it must be, when it says go back to your tents, it didn't really mean it. How's that for objectivity? How's that for taking sources seriously? But if the text is taken at face value, it is clear that at the period of the early monarchy, Israel's population was still mixed, with some residing in fixed structures in the central cities, formerly Canaanite, where they were, and the majority dwelling in tents in surrounding areas, which is a large community and organized and integrated and politically sophisticated, living in tents. This possibility is reinforced by the fact that in the biblical accounts of later periods, the use of the term tent was significantly reduced and its contexts were made more specific. After the death of Solomon and the subsequent events, the division of the kingdoms, the use of the word tent is used less, meaning at that point in time there was less of a tent-dwelling population. But for 500 years, it was a tent-dwelling population. And when they came into Canaan, it was a tent-dwelling population. Yeah.
Might be a dumb question, but does tent necessarily equal nomadic? And there is, like
Well,
the Bible or the Torah says
tents are portable.
land.
Tents are portable.
Well, I understand, but like the Torah says the land was divided up and families were.
Well, it could be divided up, but we're not now talking necessarily about the whole population moving to Iraq. We're talking about people changing residence. If you build a stone house, that's where you live. If you have a tent that you can roll up and put on your camel and go someplace else, then you're not fixed in place.
But how does that play with, like this land is the tribe of Judah and
Oh well, there were no boundaries. There wasn't a law that you had to reside within the boundaries of your tribe. That was the land that was given to that tribe. The tribes were mixed in population. When we talk about the 10 tribes being taken off by the Assyrians, it doesn't mean that no one of the tribe of God survived. No one of the tribe of Yisachar survived. There were some living in the southern kingdom also. That's why we say no tribe ever went extinct. However, the most meaningful support for the reconstitution or central nomadic element in the country actually comes from archaeology. Okay, now he goes on to a very detailed example here of a problem in archaeology, which also contributes to the case. It's easy to understand how conceptions that see the transition to permanent settlement as a rapid progress, and the nomads of the period historically negligible population took hold in biblical archaeology. We are now saying that, consistent with the text, the transition from nomadic to a fixed population with fixed housing took 500 or 600 years. The contrary has been the assumption. The contrary is the Jews had to go from Egypt through the desert to Israel. That's a nomadic journey. But then, right away, they started building houses. It happened right away. And therefore, you find the population with the houses. And therefore, if there are very few houses, it's a very small population. And therefore, biblical texts that talk about the kingdom and so on and so on are all false, because they talk about big populations, and they can't be big populations. That's the illogic. After all, because nomads are archaeologically invisible, any other departure would have diminished archaeology's very ability to contribute to the period's historical reconstructions. A little bit of disciplinary pride here. Let's see. Should we think there are large nomadic populations or not? Well, if there are large nomadic populations and archaeology can't discover them, then archaeology isn't as important as we thought, is it? Can't be trusted as much as we thought, can it? Maybe its conclusions are dreadfully incomplete. We don't want to publicize that. We don't want to support that. We're shooting ourselves in the foot. We're crippling our own discipline. Don't take that seriously. Discard nomadic populations so that archaeology can still be the key element in discovering the nature of ancient societies. That's very objective, right? It's objectively contributing to your own paycheck.
It's still being used as a means, no?
I'm sorry, say again?
It's still being used as a means to draw the theological conclusion.
Theological conclusion?
The archaeology, like, we're still using it up until the conclusion, and just like, now there's fewer houses, but more people because of tents. Like, it's still being used to help frame this conclusion.
Oh no, I don't think that's right. If the means archaeology has to determine a population is, let's say, stone houses, and you say, well, that's how archaeology does it, but there can be any size populations that don't live that way. So maybe there aren't any. Maybe nobody lives in tents. Maybe they only live in stone houses. Maybe half the population lived in tents. Maybe 3/4 of the population lived in tents. It means that when archaeology gets finished with its description, we have lots of unanswered questions, which can't be answered by archaeology, because these populations are invisible to the archaeological tools. Which means archaeology could say, well, we've given you this evidence, but we don't know what the conclusion is because there's lots of other things that our evidence can't show. That definitely diminishes the importance of archaeology. Today, archaeology's status as a supreme judge concerning the historicity of various events in the Bible stories is almost unchallenged. One reason for this is the advancement of simplistic approaches in regard to nomads. People today, he says, don't distrust archaeology because they've gotten used to a method which says nomads don't count. Of course, this state of affairs is not the product of deliberate strategy. I was sort of hinting that it was, wasn't I? No, but of a natural process that occurs in every institutionalized field of research. You trust your research, you believe in your research, you believe in your methods. It's not deliberate, it's just the way in which now physics is just as bad. Well, that's nice for archaeology. They're not really an outlier. All sciences are like that. Does that make you happy? Does that make you feel? So I don't know. He can't really say that. You don't know that for sure. He just wants to make it sound like he's objective. Then he uses another set of examples of where they trusted walls and they trusted houses to draw all their conclusions. In other words, there are other exceptions where they change their mind. Okay, I'll skip those. You can look those up. I'm going to leave this here so you can read if you want. Now, the numbering of the Israelites. How many were there? As opposed to the meagerness of the archaeological findings in Judah and the hill country in general, in the period associated with the United Monarchy, King David, was he really a king? Was it really a kingdom? Was it really a nation that was united under a king? This was all regarded as fluff. Biblical exaggeration written 300 years later to glorify your ancestors. The impressive contemporaneous remains of Philistine sites, which identify with the biblical gods, stand out. The extravagance uncovered a vast walled city. This contrast between the hill country of Philistia is cited in research as evidence, if not absolute proof, that if a kingdom existed in Jerusalem, it was weak and of negligible historical impact. The Canaanites made vast, intricate cities. And the Jews don't have them. Why not, do you think? Must be because there were very few of them. And they didn't need vast cities. So, that being the case, there must have been a very small population. However, if we take into account the different social, cultural background of the two populations, in the hill country on the one hand, the coastal plain on the other, together with a substantial disparity in the character of the archaeological evidence that each of them could be expected to leave, it's obvious that there's a basic methodological flaw here. To say that the Canaanites built large cities, there must be a large population, and the Jews who didn't build the large cities didn't have a large population, There's a basic methodological flaw. Whereas the socio-political entity that developed in the hill region bore a tribal nomadic character until Saul, there wasn't a king. There were only tribes. They didn't have a central organization. The Philistine and the Canaanites alongside them had an urban background. They weren't rural, they were urban. The archaeological disparity reflects this difference above all. Not the size of the population, but the culture and organization of the population. And its translation into geopolitical power and historical influence is necessarily simplistic. To say that the Canaanites, who had large cities, therefore had large populations, and therefore were powerful and had influence, and the Jews who didn't have large cities, they had a small population, and an unorganized population, therefore couldn't have influence, is just a mistake. It's a mistake in methodology. Another example, there's inclusion of Finkelstein and Professor Benjamin Sass, all these people who don't want the Bible to be true, that the appearance of writing in Judah occurred relatively late. Why is it that they say the occurrence of, and therefore literacy, occurred in Judah relatively late, relies principally on a comparison of the quantity of the written remains between this region and Philistia. Not that there weren't writings in Judah early on. There were, but very few. Aha. There are very few. So that means that, well, let's see, there's writing, so I guess some people were literate, but if there are very few, then it must be that there were very few people, very few literate people, because there are very few remains. But the light was notable of, it's possible that writing was no less widespread in Judah, only the archaeological mirror created a research distortion, because if you have large cities with closely related populations, then you'll have gatherings of writings which are needed for general information and so forth and so on. If you have a widespread, spread out population, then the chances of finding them is much less, because they aren't gathered in places, they aren't centralized, and therefore you're going to find less. Not that there were less, but you're going to find less. And therefore finding less doesn't prove, this goes back to what he said, same thing. That means archaeology can't determine that there weren't more. It won't say that there were, but it can't determine that there weren't. And they based their conclusion that writing was late in Judah on the basis of not finding. And there's an adage in archaeology which it says, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Now, that sounds clever, doesn't it? Doesn't that sound snazzy? Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. So you think, well, sometimes it is, Is George home? Well, all the lights are off. So I guess he isn't home, But no, that means sometimes if you know the evidence has to be there and it's missing, then you have a good reason to think that the thing didn't happen. But you have to know that it has to be there. And what he's criticizing is you have no way to know that you won't find it if it's there. You may not find it even if it's there, or even if it was there. So that being the case, in this case for sure, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, and that's exactly what they drew the conclusion on. Writing is late in Judah because we didn't find more examples of writing earlier. In this case, that turns out to be just a mistake. Yeah.
So this whole article seems to create an important gap in the methodology of archaeology. Like in several cases, there has to be like a gap for all the nomadic people and all those that literally leave no speeches.
It creates a gap, but it does more than that. And this is what I said when I started this year, 20 minutes ago. You ask yourself, I have a discipline, and it's now been discovered that there's a gap which requires reevaluating everything you know about a 500-year period. Mm-hmm. Wow. What's the probability of finding another gap in another 10 years? I think it's quite high. It means that the discipline is not well-founded. Mm-hmm. Worse than that, they presented it as well-founded. They presented their conclusions as well-established. and it wasn't. This is not a trustworthy discipline. It's not a trustworthy discipline. So the other ones that haven't yet been upended, you have to ask if this gap was found now 4 years ago. 4 years ago. So then, shouldn't we expect that there are going to be other surprises in the future? I think this should make us cautious about. Now, as I said, I have another 15 articles on my blog, and you can look them up with similar. They're not as dramatic as this one. This one is the most dramatic of all, but there are many others where mistakes were made and where things where conclusions were drawn that were incorrect. So if you want a skeptical read, and these aren't my articles, they're articles from publications. If you want to read articles about how you should be cautious about archaeology, you can find them on my blog. Yeah.
Do you see the next methodological gap that occurs? Do you see that probably happening within the same 500-year period, or do you think it might be more likely?
Listen, I'm not an archaeologist. I only read the literature and I reproduce it for people out of interest. I'm not trained in it myself. There are other things I happen to know about it. Maybe if we have time, I'll talk about them as well. Let me finish the outline of this article. Okay, there's some history of biblical archaeology. Okay, but could King David, have ruled a population that did not build fortified cities of stone and monumental structures, and most of who lived in tents, yet were subject of a strong kingdom nevertheless? Is it possible that David should be understood in dissociation from the Bedouin model, where nomads are small, simplistic, Bronze Age populations with no sophistication and no power and no ability to affect their surroundings? Is it possible that David's population would be different and seen as a tribal nomadic leader who more closely resembles Nabatean kings of Genghis Khan? The archaeology of Arava shows explicitly that this is possible, and that a similar situation existed in the neighboring kingdom in the south in the same period. So if we know 10,000 shafts for mining, which requires thousands and thousands of workers, aside from the people who are raising bread and cows and all the rest, if we know that it existed at the same time, then you can't rule out that David could have had such a population as well. Because this population in the Arava left no evidence of its habitations, and yet clear archaeological evidence of its size and power and wealth. So in the hill country of Judea, where there are no evidence of habitations, you cannot draw the conclusion that you didn't have a large, well-organized and sophisticated population. Support for this approach comes from an examination of characteristics of the period. Okay, historical, the rest of the history. This now goes into more history. For decades, biblical archaeology has been in the forefront of the attempt to understand better the period of the Bible. And as a veteran field, its research activity has become institutionalized within a set mold that dictates how archaeological evidence is to be uncovered and in what way it is amenable to interpretation. There are rules to this game, what Thomas Kuhn called a paradigm. Over the course of time, in the light of the perception of archaeology as an objective science, that's why I made fun of calling it a science at the beginning, he puts those words objective science in quotation marks, what are called scare quotes, that relies on extra-biblical observation from the field. Don't pay attention to what the Bible says. That's all made-up stuff. That's fluff. That has no reliance. We rely on hard artifacts that you can dig out of the ground. Its central role in discussion of the historicity of the Bible also achieved uncontested status. No one could qualify with archaeology. Let me just stick in a footnote here. I can't resist this. I saw this in a book by a guy named Ford. You may have heard about the documentary hypothesis that the Torah was composed out of different documents at different times and then put together by an editor and so forth and so on. There isn't a single shred of archaeological evidence for that. Not one shred. Not one text, not one clay tablet, nothing, zero. If archaeology is supposed to be so important, how come JEPD doesn't have to be backed up with archaeology? Oh, well, we're criticizing the Bible, see, then the Bible's off limits, you can do whatever you want. To this day, scholars from abutting disciplines, that means close disciplines, biblical criticism, history, for example, turn to archaeology for answers to key questions about the period. As the scholars from these disciplines, like the members of the general public, are not familiar with the gamut of methodological difficulties that underlie archaeological interpretation, they accept unreservedly the conclusions arrived at by the professionals, in quotation marks. That's what the experts say, so that must be true. They don't know how much the experts are guessing. They don't know how much the experts are using a methodology which, until a few years ago, was considered to be solid and now is known not to be solid. Although archaeologists customarily argue among themselves, oh yeah, in the back room, in these technical journals, which aren't reported in the press, which no layman ever reads, they do argue with each other about these conclusions. All the sides behaving according to the same rules of the game, and there's almost no discussion within the discipline, so it's outside of the interpretive framework itself. How do you interpret? Why do you interpret? What makes the interpretations appropriate? The chance of discovering the Arava of a strong kingdom that is not based on permanent settlements means that we are back to square one, at least with regard to periods in which there were, or could have been, societies that possessed a nomadic component. In the light of this, the Bedouin model, that they must be small, ignorant, backwards, and unimpressive, fixation must end. No more Bedouin model for all the nomadic societies, etc. Now, I'll give you an example. There was a woman named Kathleen Kenyon who was knighted by the British Empire for her contributions to archaeology. And she dug up Jericho. She did 2 shafts into Jericho. And she was famous for using what was, at that time, the accepted dating criterion of pottery. Because pottery, we know, you can see by the spread of a certain type of pottery, you can know where it originated from. And you know the trade routes, how it spread from place to place. And you can see that, let's say Cyprus was a place that created pottery. You can see first it was a Cyprus, then it was on the sea area of the seaside area of Israel, and then it spread to the inland gradually, and so forth and so on. So you can trace dating on the basis of pottery. So she dates Jericho in such a way that Joshua could not have conquered it. It was destroyed before Joshua entered the land. And the song and dance of all the historians and archaeologists, the later generations made up a story to glorify their ancestors, that they conquered Jericho, but really it didn't happen. It happened some other kind of war. And that's where the story of the book of Joshua came from. So a critical archaeologist pointed out a few flaws in her research. One thing is this: she sunk 2 shafts into that period of the mound of Jericho. She herself says that what she found at the bottom of her excavation was the poor section of the city. Oh, the poor section of the city. Now let's see. We're dating the time period by the presence of imported Cypriot pottery, are we? Is that where you expect to find the newest imported pottery, in the poor section of the city? No? Then maybe if you looked in the rich section, you'd find it. And he didn't find it. So is that really a solid conclusion? Furthermore, a guy named Garstang did Jericho in the 30s, and he dug up lots and lots of pottery, but he did a lousy job classifying it, a lousy job identifying it. So she just ignored his findings and went about finding. She could have supplemented it with a lot more pottery from Jericho. She ignored it. So you think she was knighted by the British Empire for her contributions. She dated it on the base of pottery. There are other things wrong with pottery as well, as I don't remember. And she made this kind of mistake. It's sort of like saying, well, I didn't wash out the beaker before I did the experiment, and it grew algae. So I don't know. Maybe it was the food I put in it. Maybe it was the slime from the previous experiment, because I didn't wash it out. Does that matter that I didn't wash out the beaker? Would you trust that for chemistry? I don't think so. Here, she didn't report or didn't recognize the fact that she dug to this poor section of the city, and therefore, maybe the absence of the Cypriot pottery isn't as significant as she thought. I mean, you hear things like that and you think, is this, what's going on here? Like the things I told you about evolution. You didn't think of this obvious objection. You didn't think of how critical is this? How much controversy is there going on from outside points of view? How much self-examination? Yeah, but maybe, just maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe we should think about it again. I don't know. That's the lesson from here. So there are many other things that are problematic about archaeology. As I said, you can look at my blog for it. I'm leaving this article here for those who want to read it, and you can look it up. It's October 19th, 2019, and the author's name is Erez Ben Yosef. If you just Google "a chance discovery changes everything," you'll get the article right away. Yeah.
Archaeologically speaking, or historically speaking, and the way that it conforms or separates from or frustrates Bible critics, what do you think is the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
I have nothing to say about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I never studied them. I know that they're problematic. First of all, we don't know who wrote them. If you don't know who wrote them, there was, at that period of time, different groups of Jews who had different beliefs. We know that from our own sources. There were people whom we regard as heretics. Some of them even became high priests. So the population of Jews was mixed. So you don't know who wrote them. And that being the case, they certainly have to be taken with a great deal of skepticism to cast a light on our. In the Cairo Geniza, you have texts, but you put a text in Geniza when it was no longer functional. Now, it could be no longer functional for a variety of reasons. As parchment gets old, I think they say parchment lasts at most 1,000 years. If you have 500 years old, the letters start to crack and starts to become brittle and so forth and so on. You could put it in Geniza for that reason. Or you could discover that it was written by the wrong person or inaccurate in its statement and put it in the Geniza for that reason also. So again, the fact that it's in the Geniza doesn't mean that we pledge allegiance to the text. It's very hard to verify the relevance of the text to the history of what we call normative Judaism. So, it's interesting to look at, but more than that, I don't know what we could say about it. Okay, tomorrow I'll pick up something else.